Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into one of the quietest jobs in history. Quiet, except for the occasional shovel scraping through dirt. At 2 a.m., welcome to the eerie, forgotten world of graveyard watchers. Not ghost hunters, not priests. These were real people, paid to guard fresh corpses from being stolen by other, very alive people. It's a profession that sat somewhere between night security and horror novel protagonist. Imagine staying up all night, in a fog-drenched cemetery, listening for footsteps that shouldn't be there, all because bodies were in high demand. For science, for rituals, for reasons better left unexplained. So before you settle in, hit like and subscribe, only if you enjoy unsettling historical facts whispered calmly in the dark. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what's the weirdest job you've ever heard of? Now dim the lights. Maybe light a candle. And if you hear anything while we're talking, just assume it's the wind. Probably. Let's begin. Let's start here. Imagine a job where your shift begins when everyone else goes home. The air gets colder, and even the moon seems to be watching. You're not guarding treasure. You're not protecting the living. You're standing between the dead and those who are a little too interested in them. Being a grave watchman wasn't glamorous. There was no uniform, no heroic soundtrack, no dramatic confrontation with spirits rising from the mist. It was you, a lantern, a stick that barely qualified as a weapon, and a field of freshly buried corpses that someone might be coming for. This wasn't fiction. This was real history. In some places, it still is. You see, in certain time periods, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, bodies were in high demand. Medical schools needed cadavers for study, spiritual practitioners needed ingredients, and a fresh grave, that was inventory. So cemeteries started hiring people to do what tombstones couldn't: stay awake, stay alert, and stop very determined thieves with very bad intentions. These weren't noble knights or brave warriors. They were often poor men who needed work. They weren't chosen because they were brave. They were chosen because they'd say yes for the right amount of coin. And maybe because they didn't ask too many questions, like, why does this job pay better than working in the bakery? Why is the contract signed in pencil and not ink? And what exactly are acceptable injuries listed under the fine print? The truth is, guarding the dead was dangerous. Not because of ghosts, though you were absolutely surrounded by death and superstition, but because of the living. People don't dig up graves quietly. They come with tools, with carts, with motives. And when they see you standing between them and a week's worth of black market income, they don't always back down. There were no radios, no phones, no backup, just you and a graveyard full of secrets. And here's the beautiful irony. The job wasn't considered prestigious. You weren't admired for it. In fact, you were often looked down on, mocked for spending your nights in the company of the dead. People whispered about you, said you'd go mad, that you were cursed, that being too close to death too long changes a man. And maybe it did, because standing in the middle of a field at 3:12 a.m., when the fog thickens and the shadows move just slightly wrong, something inside you does shift. You start hearing things. Not voices. Worse. The sound of dirt being moved. Slowly. Deliberately. Somewhere it shouldn't be. You know that sound. You've been trained to listen for it. And once you hear it, you don't breathe. You just grip your lantern, hold your breath, and wait to see if you're going to live long enough to regret taking this job. This wasn't just work. It was a ritual, a night-long standoff between decay and profit, between silence and survival. And if you're thinking, well, I'd be fine, I like spooky stuff, just remember, you're not guarding bones, you're guarding value. And people will do very stupid, very violent things for value. So yes, it was a job, but not the kind you brag about. It was quiet, thankless, cold. And somewhere between the flicker of your lantern and the edge of the tree line, you began to understand. You weren't just watching graves. You were standing at the fault line between life and what comes after. You've heard of ghosts, restless spirits, wailing women in white. The occasional chain-dragging Victorian with regrets and impeccable posture. But tonight, let's talk about a different kind of ghost, the kind that doesn't float. the kind that climbs over cemetery walls with a rope, a crowbar, and an understanding of human anatomy. They were called resurrection men. And while the name sounds like a religious miracle, what they did was far less divine. Their job? Simple. Unbury the dead. Quickly, quietly, and before breakfast. Why? Because bodies were worth money. Not in a gory horror film kind of way, but in a deeply practical, unsettlingly rational way. See, back then, medical schools needed cadavers. Lots of them. You can't teach surgery without something to cut. You can't study anatomy from a drawing of a skeleton holding a sword and a banner. You need a body, preferably fresh. And no one was volunteering. So the schools looked the other way. And the resurrection men looked at the ground. They worked in teams. Some were professionals, others were desperate, most were both. They knew how long it took to dig, how to avoid watchmen, and which coffins were worth the effort. They carried hooks, canvas sacks, and sometimes even fake funeral clothes to blend in. And they moved with the kind of confidence you only have when you're very poor and very sure no one's coming to help the dead. Resurrection men didn't just dig. They harvested. They'd break into the grave, lift the lid, yank the body out by the neck or the feet, toss it in a sack, and vanish into the night. Some even bribed gravediggers, or posed as mourners. One group in Scotland reportedly dug a tunnel into a graveyard because that was easier than scaling the fence. And yes, some sold to doctors, but others sold to less reputable buyers. Occult groups, alchemists, rich families desperate to reverse death, and yes, a few very experimental artists. They were everywhere. London, Paris, Boston. Any city with a hospital and a cemetery was also a marketplace. And the product was someone's mother, someone's brother, someone who had been laid to rest until the money showed up. Authorities tried to stop it. They hired guards, built fences. Some even invented mort safes, literal cages over coffins. Not to keep things in, to keep resurrection men out. So the next time you see a peaceful grave under a moonlit sky, remember, it didn't always stay that way. Because once upon a time, there were men with shovels, who treated the dead not as memories, but as merchandise. The shift didn't start at sundown, too early. People were still around. Mourners, priests, curious children who swore they saw a ghost last week. No, the real shift began when even the dogs stopped barking. When the last lantern at the village gate flickered out, and the wind picked up just enough to make trees sound like they were whispering your name wrong. That's when you knew it was time. You stepped through the gate with your oil lamp, one eye already adjusting to the dark. You didn't expect company. But that was the problem. If anyone was there, they weren't coming to pray. Graveyard shifts are lonely by design. There's no crowd, no partner. Just rows of earth, some freshly turned, some sunken with time. You learn them by shape, by scent, by the way dew settles on certain mounds faster than others. And you remember every grave that shouldn't look disturbed. You don't walk in a straight line. That's for rookies. You walk slow, in arcs. You pause often, not because you're tired, but because you're listening. Listening is everything. The wind tells you when something's off. If it's too steady, that's fine. But if it cuts suddenly, stops too soon, something just moved. Sometimes it's a fox. Sometimes it's your own coat brushing your leg. And sometimes it's a man with a shovel who doesn't want to be seen. You learn to tell the difference. Eventually, you check each grave. You look for footprints, loose dirt, the angle of flowers people left behind. If one bouquet is lying flat when it wasn't an hour ago, you remember, and you get closer, quietly. Some watchmen smoked to stay awake. Others hummed old songs to calm their nerves. But most of them, the ones who lasted, said nothing. Because sound invites company, and not the helpful kind. No one warned you how heavy silence could be. Not just outside, but in your chest. Somewhere between your third and fourth hour, you forget what comfort sounds like. Your own breath feels too loud. And the cold? It isn't cold anymore. It's just there. A second skin. You shift your weight. Your boot sinks half an inch. Was that dirt or a loosened patch? You kneel. Hold your lamp closer. Nothing. Or maybe something. Or maybe the wind's just playing again. But you don't move. Not yet. Because if there's one thing you've learned on this job, it's that nothing happening is exactly when something's about to. The night doesn't pass. It stretches, like wet cloth being pulled slowly across your shoulders, heavy and reluctant. You don't sleep. You weren't supposed to. You weren't hired to rest. You were hired to listen for what wasn't supposed to happen. And it usually started with a sound you almost missed, that soft punch of a shovel biting into damp earth. It's a delicate sound, disturbingly specific. You wouldn't confuse it with anything else. Not wind, not animals, not the creak of a branch. You hear it once, and your heart doesn't race. It freezes, because it means someone else is here, someone who didn't knock, didn't call out, didn't ask permission. You douse your lamp. Slowly, you crouch, not because you're brave, but because standing makes you visible. And grave robbers don't like witnesses, especially breathing ones. The light you saw earlier? Gone. But now it's back. A flicker. Lantern oil. Old, weak, and used by someone who expects to leave quickly. They never plan to stay long. The sound continues. One digs. One watches. Sometimes two. The rhythm is methodical, like carpenters building something they believe in. And maybe they do. Maybe they think the body is going to help someone. Maybe it's going to a doctor, a ritual, a client with very specific needs. Maybe it doesn't matter, because in this moment, they're not thinking about ethics. They're thinking about weight, speed, and how many minutes before your route brings you close. You wait. It's the only weapon you have. Wait too long, and they're gone. Act too soon, and you're outnumbered. You grip your stick, not a sword, not a gun, just a stick. The same one you use to tap grave markers and test soft earth. It's never felt less useful. Then you see movement. The ground shifts unnaturally. Something being pulled up, not buried. And that's when you realize they're almost done. You take a breath. Not because you're ready, you never are, but because the worst thing isn't that they're stealing a body. It's that they're about to finish. And if they finish, that grave will lie quietly. No one will know. No one but you. And that's the hardest part. It's not the fear. It's not the cold. It's the question that always comes next. Do you stop them? Or do you just keep watching? This job didn't come with armor. No badge. No uniform. No dramatic soundtrack to cue your bravery. What you had was a lantern. A storm lantern. Windproof. Barely. The flame inside flickered like it was just as nervous as you. It didn't light much. Just a few feet in front of you. Enough to see the path. Not enough to see what was watching from the tree line. Next to that, you had a stick. Not metaphorically. An actual wooden staff. Hard, knotted, and roughly your height. Was it a weapon? Technically. Would it save your life? Statistically, unlikely. But it made a sound when it hit something. And in the dark, sound is power. Not just for you, for them. Grave robbers listened too. To your footsteps, your cough, the snap of a twig that said, "He's close." Some watchmen carried a flintlock, an old, one-shot firearm. Heavy, loud, temperamental. If it worked, it could kill. If it didn't, it could still scare. Assuming you didn't blow out your own eardrum in the process. But none of that. The lantern, the stick, the gun, was your most important tool. It was your hearing. Over time, your ears became trained. Not just to detect sound, but to interpret silence. You could tell the difference between wind and intention. Between a raccoon rummaging and a man digging. The ground had a voice. So did the fog. Even your own breath taught you things. If it echoed wrong, someone else was nearby. You didn't brag about this. No one writes epic ballads about a man who can tell a pine needle from a boot print just by the sound it makes. But that's what kept you alive. Sometimes, you'd feel the change before you heard it. A shift in the air. A stillness where there should be crickets. The kind of quiet that only shows up when something else has entered the scene and doesn't want to be noticed. These weren't superpowers. You weren't a hero. You were just a man, in the dark, doing his best not to die for a paycheck. So yes, you had tools, but none of them glowed in the dark or swung like a sword. They clunked. They flickered. They misfired. And somehow, you made them enough. Because in this job, it wasn't about overpowering anyone. It was about surviving long enough to know when not to make a sound. Graves don't stay safe just because you cover them with dirt, especially not the fresh ones. In fact, freshness is the problem. The moment someone's buried, that exact moment, the clock starts ticking, not for mourning, not for closure, but for theft. Because in certain centuries, in certain cities, a newly buried corpse wasn't sacred. It was valuable. It had a price. And everyone knew it. See, it wasn't just that people were stealing bodies. It was that they were doing it quickly. The most desirable corpses, taken within 24 to 48 hours of burial. Why? Because after that, things changed. Skin darkened, muscles stiffened, smells began making arguments no one could ignore. So grave robbers, resurrection men, worked fast. They watched funerals, not out of respect, but out of interest. They'd count the mourners, judge the soil, estimate how deep the coffin went. Then they'd come back later, when the wailing stopped and opportunity began. Doctors didn't want skeletons. They wanted systems, organs still intact, veins still traceable, a body that looked, let's be honest, like it still had a name. That's where the money was. And like all valuable things, fresh corpses attracted risk. Some graves were marked with sticks or flags by the resurrection gangs, like tagging a tree before cutting it down. Others were looted within hours. People buried their dead in secret. Some even staged fake funerals just to throw thieves off. But it didn't always work. Because to a grave robber, a fresh mound of earth wasn't a memory. It was merchandise. And once word got out that a family had money, that the deceased was young, healthy, recently deceased under clean conditions, that grave became a target. No tombstone, no prayer, no headscarf placed with care could stop a man who'd already been paid. They came with ropes, hooks, shallow respect. And when you, the night watchman, spotted them, it wasn't always easy to intervene. Because you weren't just fighting a thief. You were interrupting commerce. A black market transaction where the currency had once been someone's heartbeat. You learned quickly. Graves didn't get robbed at random. They were picked, like fruit. Ripe, fresh, easy to lift, and already too late to save. So every time a new burial happened, you didn't see grief. You saw a countdown. Because in this world, the most vulnerable person was the one who couldn't scream. No one tells you this part. When you're hired to guard a cemetery, you think your job is to stand, to wait, to listen, to catch things in the act, not to confirm they've already happened. But then you notice something. A mound too smooth, a flower arrangement slightly shifted, a footprint where none should be. The grave doesn't look disturbed, not exactly, but it doesn't look right either. And that's when the weight settles into your chest. Because there's only one way to be sure. You grip the shovel, you press your boot into the earth, and you begin to dig. Not fast, not like a thief, but slowly, carefully, like someone who doesn't want to find out what they already suspect. The first few inches are just dirt, loose, cold, familiar. Then you hit the harder layer, packed down by ceremony, by grief. You pause, breathe, keep going, and then the sound changes. Wood. You recognize the dull, hollow thunk of a coffin lid. You kneel, raise the lantern, brush away the last of the soil. This is the moment where your hope and your fear are the same thing. You hope they're still there. You fear they aren't. You pry the lid open. And sometimes it's worse than you imagined. It's empty, not broken, not collapsed, just gone. Or, worse still, what's inside isn't a person at all. Just clothes, neatly arranged, weighted down with stones. A deception, a substitution. Someone planned this. Someone removed the body and made it look untouched. Someone counted on no one ever checking. But you did, and now you're the only one who knows the truth. That this person, whoever they were, is no longer where they were laid to rest. You sit there, dirt on your sleeves, shovel by your side, staring into a box that holds only absence. No one trained you for this. There's no protocol, no form to fill out that says, body replaced with rocks. So you do the only thing you can. You close the lid. You fill the grave back in. You press the earth down gently, as if covering a lie with silence. Maybe the family visits tomorrow. Maybe they pray. Maybe they cry. They'll never know what's missing. They'll never hear what you found, because you won't tell them. You can't. It wouldn't help. It wouldn't bring the body back. All it would do is move the grief from quiet remembrance to open violation. So you carry the knowing alone. And you wonder, where is that person now? On a table? In a classroom? In pieces? Labeled and numbered like an object? You'll never find out. But you'll remember this moment. This grave, this emptiness, and the quiet sound of dirt falling on something that shouldn't have been empty in the first place. Because sometimes, the only thing worse than guarding the dead is discovering they're already gone. In the stories, confrontation is loud. Swords clash, fists fly. Someone yells something heroic before punching out the villain. But here, it's quiet. It's always quiet. Because when you finally come face to face with a grave robber, you're not meeting a monster. You're meeting a man, covered in dirt, breathing hard, eyes wild, not with rage, but with calculation. He's not angry. He's busy. He has a job, and you're in the way. The ground between you smells like wet soil and sweat, the kind that comes from digging fast or waiting too long to act. You don't shout. He doesn't either, because sound gets remembered. Names get repeated, and no one here wants to be remembered. Your hands tighten on the stick. His grip shifts on the shovel. It's not a standoff. It's a breathing match. Two lungs filling the same space, polluted with fear, rot, and desperation. Then, maybe, a step forward. Yours or his. It doesn't matter. Someone moves. Someone swings. Something connects. And suddenly, it's not action. It's instinct. Your wrist screams. Your knee hits stone. You're trying to stay standing. He's trying to vanish. No glory. No one-liners. Just grunts, rust, and the horrible metallic taste of adrenaline. You don't fight to win. You fight to interrupt. To make it hard. To buy enough time that someone else might notice. Or maybe, just maybe, to make him run. Sometimes it works. He drops the sack. You hear a thud that tells you the body's still inside. He vanishes into the trees. And you're left, bruised, breathless, bleeding, but victorious. Technically. Other times, he doesn't run. He swings back. Harder, smarter. And now you're on your back, staring at clouds that weren't there before. There were watchers who never got up again. They were found by dawn. Their sticks snapped in half. The grave beside them empty. And no one carved their name in stone. Because dying for a dead man wasn't considered noble. Just unfortunate. But you knew that when you took the job. That one night, the only thing standing between someone's mother and the back of a medical cart would be you, and your silence, and your will to stand one breath longer than the man who came to steal. That's not action. It's not bravery. It's not a movie. It's just another grave. One that stayed full, because you didn't blink first. Corpses don't scare you. Not after the first few nights. They lie still. They make no demands. They stay where you left them, silent, cold, reliable. You get used to them. Too easily, really. You stop seeing the shape of death and start seeing patterns in the way the shroud folds, the way the light rests against the edges of the coffin lid. But what you never get used to, not even after years, are the sounds. Not loud ones. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make your spine question whether it should stay upright. A crunch of gravel. A breath of wind that pauses too long at your ear. The distant sound of metal against wood. A sound no tree or fox should ever make. At first, you chase them. You lift your lantern, swing it toward the noise. You find nothing. Maybe a bird. Maybe your own boot scraping the wrong patch of stone. You tell yourself it's nothing. But then it happens again. A whisper. Not from the ground. Not from above. Just beside you. Where no one is. You freeze, and suddenly you're counting your own breathing. 1, 2, 3, trying to keep it steady, trying not to sound like prey. Because the graveyard doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels watched. Not haunted. Observed. Then comes the worst sound of all. Silence. But not peaceful silence. Not the kind that means the world is sleeping. This silence has edges. It arrives like a held breath. Not yours. Someone else's, please. You wait. You try to outlisten the quiet. And then you realize there's no wind. No animals. No rustling of trees. Something stopped moving. And whatever it was, wasn't you. Your eyes scan. Your ears stretch. You're suddenly aware of your heartbeat. The way your coat shifts when you lean. How your boot creaks when you shift weight. You stop moving altogether. Because motion makes sound. And sound invites reply. That's what terrifies you. Not what lies under the earth, but what listens above it. You remember stories. Of men who turned too slowly. Of sounds that moved without footprints. Of voices that whispered names they shouldn't have known. But the truth is simpler. More terrifying. Because sometimes the sound isn't a ghost. It's a man with a shovel. Or two. Moving quietly. Deliberately. Waiting for you to make the first mistake. They don't want confrontation. They want time. A few minutes. Enough to finish the job and leave the grave looking undisturbed. So they stay silent. They blend in. They become the absence. And in return, your fear doesn't take shape. It doesn't scream. It just waits. Because the real horror of this job, the thing that sticks with you long after your shift ends, isn't death. It isn't ghosts. It isn't the open graves or the empty coffins. It's knowing you're not alone and having no proof. Just sound. Soft. Uninvited. Patient. And the chilling certainty that someone, somewhere in the dark, is listening back. A grave is supposed to mean rest. A full stop. The last quiet sentence in a long, messy story. But at some point in history, that silence became negotiable because the dead stopped being sacred and started being useful. You see, not everybody buried in the ground was left there. Some were pulled back out, not by ghosts, not by grieving relatives, but by men with coin in their pockets and customers waiting in alleyways and lecture halls, because a corpse, once buried, didn't stay a person. It became a product. Medical schools needed cadavers. Ritualists needed ingredients. Collectors wanted curiosities. And bodies, fresh, whole, anonymous, became the currency. The math was simple. The more complete the body, the higher the price. The younger, the better. The cleaner, the more desirable. A well-preserved corpse was worth more than a month's honest wage. And just like that, someone's mother, or son, or spouse, was turned into a transaction. The language changed too. They stopped being called people. They became specimens, subjects, material. And once language lets go of humanity, the hands follow. Men dug by moonlight, not to rob rings or jewelry, not to read inscriptions, but to pull someone from their final place, cut the name loose, and sell what remained. And the buyer rarely asked. Medical students learned by cutting open strangers they never named. Practitioners tested salves on people whose families still lit incense at empty graves. Even artists, yes, artists, bought bodies to study light on muscle, and never once asked whose light they'd stolen. This wasn't a heist. It was a system. Families tried to protect the dead. They buried them deeper, added iron cages called mortsafes, held watch over the grave for a week or two. But eventually, they had to leave, and the men with hooks and wagons were patient. And when they came, they didn't just take the body, they took the meaning. The tombstone stayed, the flowers dried, the prayers echoed against nothing, and the family walked away, never knowing they were speaking to air. That's what happens when the body becomes merchandise. Dignity evacuates the scene. It doesn't matter how lovingly someone was buried, how many people cried, how ornate the casket. Once the shovel hits the soil again, for reasons other than grief, what's left isn't a person. It's parts. Even worse, no one likes to talk about it. No one wants to admit that science once ran on unpermissioned flesh. That progress often smells like decay. That discovery and desecration have occasionally walked hand in hand through the back doors of respected institutions. And you, the night watchman, you were the last hand trying to stop it. Not because you were noble, not because you were strong, but because someone had to say, quietly, this is still someone, even when everyone else had moved on, even when the living had forgotten the dead. You remembered by refusing to let them be turned into a receipt, because when the dead are reduced to value, the living lose something, too. Not just peace, not just privacy, but the simple belief that a grave means the story is over. So you stood there, lantern low, feet cold, and said nothing, because sometimes silence is the last dignity a person can have, and you protected it, as long as you could. Most people think you only die once. It happens in a bed, maybe. A final breath, a closing of the eyes, a whisper. Someone holds your hand, someone else cries, and then it's over. Except it's not. Because for some, death is followed by a second silence. One that comes days later, in the middle of the night, accompanied not by prayers or candles, but by shovels. The second death is quieter, colder, more mechanical. It begins with pressure, soil shifting, wood creaking, the dull scrape of metal against the side of your coffin. Then comes the break. The lid snaps. Arms reach in, not lovingly, not reverently, just efficiently. You're pulled up, wrapped, limp, weightless. Not a name, not a soul, just cargo. No one gasps, no one bows. There is no ceremony, only business. You are carried, tossed, loaded into something that smells like old tar and mold. You bounce, you shift, you settle, not into peace, into sail, and that's it. That's the second death. Not of body, but of meaning. The first death ended your life. The second erases your legacy. No grave, no place to visit. No one left with the comfort of, at least they're resting. Because you're not. You're somewhere else now. On a table, under a cloth, being sliced open by people who never knew your voice, who never knew your favorite meal, who never knew how you laughed in the rain. You don't belong to your family anymore. You don't belong to yourself. You belong to the system, the need, the hunger for something functional from someone finished. And it's not that they hate you. They don't. They don't think of you at all. You are parts. You are purpose. You are useful again, briefly. And then, disposal. What remains of your remains is folded, burned, buried, lost. Not under your name. Not where your family left flowers. That's the part no one says out loud. When bodies are stolen, it's not just crime. It's theft of rest. The denial of being allowed to disappear. Because in the end, that's what burial is. Permission to leave. A final act of presence, followed by absence. A soft ending. But resurrection men don't allow soft endings. They write footnotes. They interrupt closure. And for you, the watchman, that's the pain. Not that death happens, but that it gets reversed without dignity. That someone's final chapter gets edited by a man with a hook and a deadline. So when you stand over a grave at dawn, and everything looks still, and the wind carries no sound, you don't relax. You listen harder, because you know, somewhere, someone is dying again. Not in body, but in memory. You're allowed to be afraid. No one says it, of course. But even the bravest man flinches when a crow lands too hard on a tombstone. At first, you think it's the dead that scare you. The graves, the fog, the whispering wind that sounds almost, but not quite, like your name. But that passes, sooner than you'd expect. You realize quickly, the dead don't want anything. They're quiet, predictable. They stay where you left them. They don't bargain. They don't bleed. What keeps you up at night? What makes your hands shake when you light your second lantern isn't ghosts. It's men. Men who climb fences. Men who carry ropes. Men who've decided that someone's corpse is more useful than their conscience. You hear them before you see them. You smell them, sweat and old cloth and the sharp tang of rusted tools. And when they emerge from the dark, they don't look like villains. They look like you. Tired, cold, focused. They have a job to do. You just happen to be in the way. It's not personal. That's what makes it worse. You're afraid of what they'll do if you raise your voice. You're even more afraid of what they'll do if you don't. You imagine the conversations they have before coming. Only if he's old. Only if he's alone. Only if he doesn't see us first. And then they see you. And you see them. And the entire night tilts. You don't scream. Screaming is for people with help. You measure the distance. You count the steps. You wonder if the ground behind you is soft enough to fall on without breaking a rib. Because you know this. Ghosts don't carry blades. Ghosts don't bring 3 friends. Ghosts don't weigh you down and whisper threats into your ear while dragging a sack behind them. People do that. And people are messy, unpredictable, desperate, capable of more harm than any spirit ever could. That's the core of the fear. Not that something might haunt you, but that something might hurt you, leave you in your own grave, and then come back the next night to dig up someone else. So you stay alert, not because of legends, not because of curses, but because the worst thing you might see tonight has a name, a heartbeat, and somewhere a reason they think this is okay. And the next time someone asks you, "Aren't you afraid of the dead?" you'll just smile, because fear doesn't come from under the ground. It walks on it, in boots, with eyes, and a reason to pretend you're not there. You didn't take this job for glory. There's no uniform, no medals, no monument with your name carved into stone. But there was money. Not much, just enough. Enough to make a man say yes to standing alone in the dark. Enough to make him ignore the stories. At first, they paid you per night, per bodyguarded, sometimes extra if there had been a recent burial, because that's when they came the fastest. The math was simple. Each corpse intact means a full wage. A stolen one is equal to a docked pay. 2 gone in 1 week, you might lose the job entirely, because even in death, performance was everything. And so you watched. You listened. You stayed awake even when your eyes begged for sleep. And when people asked why you did it, you'd shrug. The pay's decent, and the company doesn't talk back. But here's the part they never put in the contract. The longer you stayed, the stranger things got. Not ghosts. Not demons. Just moments. The dreams, for instance. You didn't have them at first. But then they started coming. Faces you'd never seen before, looking up at you from the dirt. Mouths moving, no sound. Eyes wide, asking something without words. Then there were the names. Whispered. Not loudly, never loudly. Just soft enough to make you wonder if you'd heard it at all. Sometimes it was yours. Sometimes it wasn't. Some men laughed it off. Too much night air, messes with your head. Others left. No warning, no explanation. They just didn't show up for the next shift. And no one asked why. But the rumors remained. Passed from one watchman to the next like tools. Stories about men who forgot how to sleep during the day. Men who started seeing footprints outside their window only at night. Men who heard the sound of shovels long after they'd left the graveyard behind. They called it a curse. Not the loud, dramatic kind. Not blood or boils or thunderclaps. Just erosion. Of self. Of silence. Of whatever wall kept the dead in their place, and you in yours. Some said the job followed you. That once you'd heard the earth being opened for the wrong reasons, you couldn't unhear it. That your ears became tuned to it. Even if you moved. Even if you quit. And some swore, in half whispers, usually after too much rice wine, that something came back with you. Not a ghost. Not a spirit. Just the knowledge. That graves are not endings. That dirt is not a barrier. That some things, once touched, never truly let go. So yes, there was money. There was always money. But sometimes, late at night, in a room that was too quiet, you'd find yourself listening again, for a sound you hoped you'd never hear. And that's when you'd understand. You didn't just get paid. You got marked. Most people leave behind a name. Some leave behind stories. A few leave monuments. But for many, all they leave is a grave. One plot of land, one stone, a short line of text that tries to summarize a lifetime. And in the silence that follows, someone is expected to watch. Not for the sake of tradition, not for the afterlife, but for dignity. That someone is you, the grave watchman, a title no one honors, a job no one celebrates, but one that matters more than anyone admits. Because you're not guarding treasure, you're not protecting secrets, you're standing between memory and erasure. The dead can't fight back. They can't plead. They can't shout, "Leave me be, I've already been taken once." But you can, not always successfully, not always safely, but sometimes just enough. Enough to make a thief hesitate. Enough to make a family never know what almost happened. Enough to keep a name from being sold by the kilogram. And that is something. In a world where people steal everything, land, labor, stories, you are the one keeping what's final, truly final. You are the last boundary, the last defense, the quiet wall between human and object. No sermons, no uniforms, just tired feet and sharp ears. And while the world moves on, with its wars, its crowns, its markets, you remain in the background, keeping the ground still. You see generations pass through grief. You hear confessions whispered to stones. You notice which graves are never visited again, and you protect them anyway, because all dignity is borrowed, and someone has to return it. You never ask who the dead were. It doesn't matter. Rich or poor, beloved or forgotten. Everyone deserves to stay in the ground once they've been put there. That's not heroism. That's decency. And decency, like bones, is easy to overlook until it's gone. So you light your lamp. You do your rounds. You check the soil, the air, the shadows. And no one sees you. No one thanks you. But still, you stay. Because when no one is left to speak for the dead, you do it by standing still, by listening, by making sure that the last thing taken from a person isn't their right to rest. You don't write history. You guard what's left of it, one grave at a time. And if you ever wonder whether it was worth it, whether anyone noticed, whether anything you did mattered, just look down at the graves that stayed closed, the names that stayed undisturbed, the silence that stayed sacred. You didn't save the world, but you saved someone's ending. And sometimes, that's the last kindness left. So now you know, graveyards aren't just quiet because the dead are resting. They're quiet because, for centuries, someone stood in that silence and made sure it stayed that way. The grave watchman didn't leave behind books. He didn't become a folk hero. Most never had their names recorded at all. But they were there, night after night, with a lantern, a stick, and a kind of tired bravery that doesn't show up in stories, because it doesn't shout. It endures. They fought nothing supernatural. They didn't cast out spirits. They simply stood between grief and greed, between memory and market. And while they didn't always win, they won enough. Enough to keep a few bodies untouched, a few names remembered, a few families at peace, never knowing how close their mourning came to being interrupted. That's what this job was. Not sacred, not noble, just necessary. And somewhere, maybe, it still is. So if you ever pass a graveyard at night and feel something watching, don't be afraid. It's probably not a ghost. It's just someone like you, a little cold, a little tired, making sure no one comes to take what's already been let go. Now close your eyes. Rest easy. The dead aren't alone. Someone's still watching. And for tonight, that's enough. The 9th century, a time when knowledge was hidden behind doors few could open. And if you were a woman, those doors were rarely built for you at all. This was a world defined by borders, between faith and doubt, between rich and poor, between those who wrote history and those forgotten by it. And for most women, the lines were drawn long before they ever had a chance to cross them. Their names were seldom remembered. Their stories, if told, were framed in shadows. Daughters of someone, wives of someone, mothers of someone, never simply someone. To be a woman in the 9th century was to live under layers of expectation, woven by religion, culture, tradition, and silence. You were expected to bear children, serve your family, know your place. You were expected to believe, not to question. And above all, you were expected to stay unseen in matters of the mind. Reading and writing? Those were not part of a young girl's world. In many regions, especially across North Africa and the Middle East, literacy itself was a form of privilege. Even among men, few mastered the pen. Among women, it was almost unheard of. To learn to read the Quran was a religious duty, but understanding its deeper meanings, that was left to men. To write letters, debate philosophy, study logic, or astronomy, those belonged to scholars, jurists, imams, always male. In this world, women were often seen as guardians of the home, not the libraries. Their intellect was doubted, their voices softened, their thoughts silenced. And yet, beneath the silence, something else stirred, not loudly, not in rebellion, but like a seed growing beneath stone. Imagine it. A city like Fez, vibrant, golden with sun, lined with narrow alleys, and the hum of call to prayer. A place filled with merchants, scholars, travelers from distant lands. Among the markets and mosques, the scent of cardamom in the air, life moved in rhythms both ancient and alive. It is here that a girl, unknown to most, began to ask different questions. In a time when girls were told what to believe, she wondered how things came to be. In a world where women bowed their heads, she lifted hers, quietly but surely. Her name was Fatima. Not yet famous, not yet written into textbooks, just a daughter of a merchant, just another shadow in the crowd. But she had something rare: access. Her family was wealthy, her father valued knowledge, and in a world where fortune decided who would read, she was allowed to learn. She studied the Quran, but also listened. She watched the way people argued in the market. She noticed how men gathered in circles to debate ideas, while women waited on the edges. And perhaps, she wondered, why? This wasn't revolution. It was reflection, and reflection, in the right heart, can become something powerful. Because you see, what made the 9th century so difficult for women wasn't just the rules, it was how invisible those rules had become. No one needed to say, "You can't." It was already written into the architecture of daily life. Who entered mosques through which door? Who spoke first? Who sat in silence? Fatima wasn't loud. She didn't march. She didn't write manifestos. But she was watching, listening, and most of all, she was preparing. The world told her, stay small, be obedient, pray, marry, give birth, repeat. But Fatima's story, like so many before and after her, started with a quiet refusal. A refusal to believe that faith and thought had to live apart. A refusal to accept that being a woman meant being left behind. And in the heart of that refusal, something extraordinary was about to grow. Would you like me to continue with section 2 in the same tone and limit next? She arrived in Fez as a child, her family having left their homeland in what is now Tunisia. A long journey across North Africa, over dry land and hot wind, into a city humming with trade and stories and faith. Fez was growing, expanding, becoming a center of knowledge and religion, and in this city of stone and sun, a girl named Fatima began her quiet life. Her father, Muhammad al-Fihri, was a wealthy merchant. Not royalty, not a nobleman, just a man who traded honestly and earned well. But what made him different was what he valued. He believed in knowledge. He saw worth not only in gold or land, but in words, in understanding, in the minds of his daughters. And so, while other girls were taught how to serve, how to sew, how to endure, Fatima was taught how to read. She studied the Quran, not simply reciting its verses, but learning their meaning. She listened to the imams, watched the scholars, and felt something stir within her, a kind of calm hunger, a desire not for power, not for praise, but for depth, for wisdom that didn't end in prayer, but began there. Still, she was quiet. Fatima was not the kind of figure history books usually notice. She did not conquer armies or write volumes of law. She was not loud or rebellious or crowned. She walked softly, observed deeply, and kept most of her thoughts to herself. But inside her, there was a vision. Not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that waited for the right moment. Tragedy came, as it often does, without warning. First, her father died. Then, her husband. Within a short span of time, the pillars of her world collapsed. In the eyes of the society around her, she had become what many feared being, a widow, a woman alone, a figure to be pitied, to be managed. But Fatima did not collapse with her grief. She did not remarry. She did not retreat. What she did was unexpected. She took the inheritance left to her, quietly, legally, without spectacle, and she began to plan. Not a market, not a mansion, not a shrine. Fatima envisioned something else entirely. A space for learning. A place where people, regardless of their class, their origin, or their gender, could come to think, to ask questions, to read, to listen, to understand, not because she wanted fame, but because she had known, from a young age, how rare and sacred knowledge could be, and how cruel it was to keep it behind closed doors. The Fez of her time was not unlike other great cities of the medieval world. It had mosques, markets, palaces, but it did not yet have something that brought knowledge together in one place, under one roof, with the intention not just to teach, but to cultivate thought. Fatima would change that. She found a plot of land. She gathered resources. She oversaw the design. She fasted during the construction, day after day, not as a symbol, but as a personal vow, a spiritual discipline, aligning her sacrifice with her vision. Her dream took shape slowly, like stone layered upon stone. It would be called Al-Karawiyin, named after the people of her original homeland, Al-Kairouan, a gesture of memory, of origin, of belonging. And though it began as a mosque, as so many sacred spaces did in that era, it would grow into something more, a center of learning, a gathering of minds, a place where faith met thought and silence gave way to speech. Fatima never lectured there. She never stood on a podium or signed her name to scrolls. She never asked for her portrait to be painted or her story to be carved in stone. But she built something that would outlast kings. It is easy to think that only the loudest voices change history, that only battles and declarations shape the world. But Fatima Alfieri reminds us of something softer and deeper. That vision can come wrapped in silence, that strength doesn't always roar, and that sometimes a woman with a quiet dream can build a future that even time itself cannot erase. Grief often arrives without sound. It slips into a room, settles like dusk, and stays longer than it's welcome. For Fatima Alfieri, grief did not knock, it simply took. First, her father, the man who taught her the value of knowledge, of curiosity, of dignity beyond wealth. He was gone. His presence, once so steady, disappeared like the fading outline of a memory. Then her husband, a quieter man, perhaps, but someone who had walked beside her with respect. He too vanished from her life. And so, within a span of months, Fatima stood alone. A woman in the 9th century, no longer a daughter, no longer a wife. The world would have expected her to shrink, to mourn, to retreat. And for a while, she did. She wore the colors of mourning. She prayed. She wept. She let the ache move through her like a tide. But she did not allow it to drown her. Where others might have seen her story ending, Fatima began again. She was not powerful by name, not royal, not revered, but she had something many did not: choice. Her father had left her an inheritance, not just of wealth, but of trust. He had raised her with the tools to think, and now she would decide how to use them. Fatima could have rebuilt her personal life, married again, lived in comfort, or simply withdrawn into solitude. But what she did was neither expected nor ordinary. She looked at the city around her, Fez, alive with merchants and worshippers, students and strangers, a place of trade, prayer, and potential. And she asked a quiet question. What if there was a space where knowledge could be more than privilege? not just sermons from pulpits or private scrolls in scholars' homes, but open learning, shared learning, a sanctuary not just for faith, but for the mind. She imagined a place where ideas could breathe, where logic could be explored alongside scripture, where poetry, science, and philosophy could be studied in the light of belief, not in contradiction to it. It was not a dream born of ambition, it was born of clarity. Fatima began to plan, not with fanfare, but with focus. She dedicated her inheritance to something greater than herself. Not a monument, not a mausoleum, but a foundation. And so, with deliberate steps, she began to build. The land was secured. The design was prepared. Builders were summoned. The work was set in motion. And throughout the long months of construction, Fatima did something quietly radical. She fasted. Every day. Not for attention, not for martyrdom, but as an act of purification, a way to stay spiritually connected to what she was creating. A prayer in motion. Her fasting became her language. Her silence, a kind of vow. This would not be a space built with noise and pride, but with devotion. She called it Al-Karawiyin, named in honor of her hometown, Al-Kayrawan, a name that held memory, identity, and intent. It was a personal gesture woven into public service. At first, it would serve as a mosque, a sacred space. But Fatima's vision extended further. She understood something profound, that worship and wisdom were not enemies, that to question was not to rebel, but to deepen one's faith. And slowly, the space grew. From prayer hall to classroom, from recitation to reflection. The boundaries between religion and reason began to blur in the best way. Scholars came, discussions blossomed, disciplines expanded. Fatima herself never stood in front of the gatherings. She did not preach, she did not teach, but every stone, every arch, every courtyard whispered her intent. She did not seek titles. She did not demand recognition. But her actions spoke with a voice time could not silence. To lose is human. To rebuild with purpose is rare. Fatima al-Fikhri lost the men who anchored her life. But she found in herself something even more enduring, a purpose that would outlive every pain. In a world that tried to define her by absence, she left behind presence, in stone, in legacy, in the quiet unfolding of a dream too steady to be shaken. It began, as many sacred things do, with stillness. In the heart of Fez, under the burnished skies of the 9th century, the hum of prayer and the murmur of trade formed the rhythm of daily life. Dust curled in the light. Cloth hung heavy in doorways. In a quiet part of the city, a plot of land waited, unspectacular, ordinary, unnoticed. But one woman had seen it differently. Fatima al-Fihri had walked that earth with purpose. After loss, after mourning, she had turned not to stone walls of grief, but to blueprints, not for a palace, not for a market, but for something that had never quite existed, not like this. A sanctuary for the soul, yes, but also for the mind. Her vision was clear, to build a mosque that welcomed worshippers, but also drew scholars. A space where learning was not confined to scrolls in private chambers, or whispered debates among men in power, but could be woven into the very walls of devotion. And so, construction began. Stone by stone, hand by hand. Artisans shaped columns from limestone. Masons etched floral patterns into the archways. Carpenters carved cedar doors that would open not just to footsteps, but to questions. Everything about the building carried meaning. Not opulence, but intention. While workers built, Fatima fasted. Each day, every day. Not out of spectacle, not for admiration, but as an act of spiritual solidarity with what she was creating. While her body grew thinner, her vision grew sharper. She believed the project was not just architecture, it was prayer in form. Her fast was her vow, to offer the structure not just as a gift, but as an act of faith. When it opened in 859, the space was called Al-Karawiyin, named after the people of her hometown, Al-Kayrawan. It was both tribute and invitation, a tether to the past and a hope for the future. At first, it served as a mosque. Men gathered to pray. Sermons echoed through the prayer hall. But soon, it began to grow, not in size, but in spirit. A corner was set aside for learning, then a room, then another. Scrolls were shared. Teachers began to speak, not just of the Quran, but of grammar, logic, mathematics. Astronomy was introduced, philosophy, law, medicine. A curriculum took shape, not designed by a king, not enforced by a council, but nurtured by the slow, organic hunger of people who wanted to understand the world, and they came. From across the Maghreb, from Andalusia, from Cairo and Damascus, students traveled by foot and by camel to sit in the shaded courtyards of Al-Qarawiyyin, to study under scholars who wrote not just in ink, but in presence. They read texts translated from Greek, debated ethics, charted stars. There were no gates keeping out the poor, no ceilings drawn over the curious. The only requirement was humility before knowledge and patience. And through it all, Fatima remained in the background. She did not demand a title. She did not inscribe her name over the doorway, but the walls remembered her. The arches carried her vision. The syllables of every recited verse echoed her purpose. She had carved a space for something revolutionary, a woman funding and founding a university without ever needing to shout about it. Over time, Al-Qarawiyyin became more than a mosque, more than a madrasa. It became a university, perhaps the oldest still operating in the world, centuries before Oxford. Long before the concept of university became common in Europe, UNESCO would later confirm it. But long before that, the people of Fez already knew what Fatima had built was rare. A place where faith and intellect were not enemies. A place where science could sit beside scripture, where astronomy could dance with theology, where thinking was not feared, but welcomed as a form of devotion. Even the structure itself reflected this harmony. The water clock in the courtyard, the elaborate chandeliers, the mihrab glowing with carved verses. It was beautiful, yes, but also functional. A blend of aesthetic and purpose, just like Fatima's vision. Generations would pass through its halls. Some would write books that reshaped law. Others would go on to inspire revolutions of mind across borders and centuries. But none of them would have passed through the gates had a woman, years before, not chosen to build them. When people hear the word university, they might imagine grand stone towers, ivy-covered walls, or long lecture halls buzzing with restless students. They might think of Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard. Names that carry centuries of tradition, cloaked in prestige. But the oldest university in the world? The very first to grant degrees, to welcome students into structured, sustained learning? It wasn't in England. It wasn't in Europe at all. It was in Fez, Morocco, and it was founded not by a king or a pope or a scholar in robes, but by a woman named Fatima al-Fihri. It's easy to overlook this truth. For centuries, history was written in ink that skipped over women's names. It favored rulers and warriors, often ignoring builders of books and minds. And yet, quietly, without asking for recognition, Fatima built something that would last longer than most empires. In 859, the doors of Al-Qarawiyyin opened. What began as a mosque became a madrasa, and over time, it evolved into a center of higher learning. Teachers gathered, students came, and over the years, a rhythm of study took root, organized teaching, recorded progress, formal scholarship, what we would now call a university. And unlike many medieval institutions, Al-Qarawiyyin never closed. Through political upheavals, dynastic shifts, and the slow turning of centuries, it continued. Classes were taught. Books were copied. Ideas flowed like water from its carved fountains. That continuity, that unbroken thread, is what makes Al-Qarawiyyin special. UNESCO and the Guinness Book of World Records both recognize it as the oldest existing and continually operating university in the world. Older than Oxford by more than 200 years. Older than the University of Bologna. Older than the idea of a university as Europe would later define it. And at the heart of its origin is Fatima, a woman, in a century where most women couldn't even read. It's worth pausing on that. Fatima lived in a time when education for women was rare. when society expected women to serve, not study. When decisions about religion, science, and law were made in rooms she likely would not have been invited into, had she not built the room herself. She never taught in Al-Qarawiyyin. She never claimed a title. She didn't write books or lead lectures, but she created the space where it could all happen. And sometimes, that is the most powerful act of all. It's tempting to imagine her watching, quietly, from a shaded doorway, seeing students enter, seeing teachers raise questions, seeing words bloom into knowledge, and knowing, deep down, that her grief had been reshaped into something generous, lasting, and alive. The university welcomed more than just Quranic study. Over the years, Al-Qarawiyyin expanded its curriculum to include mathematics, astronomy, grammar, law, medicine, and philosophy. It attracted thinkers from across the Islamic world and beyond. Some of its influence reached Europe, through translations, through migration, through the subtle bridges that knowledge always finds a way to cross. While European universities were still forming, Al-Qarawiyyin had already nurtured generations of scholars. Yet, for centuries, Fatima's name was barely mentioned in the pages of history books. It took time, far too long, for the world to look back and recognize what she had done. But today, her name is resurfacing. Her story is being reclaimed, and rightfully so, because Fatima al-Fikhri is more than a historical footnote. She is a symbol of what is possible when someone dares to plant something deeply needed, even when no one is watching. She is proof that you do not need power, permission, or a platform to change the course of history. You just need vision, and the courage to act on it. In a time when women were often told to stay small, she built something vast. In a world that prized loud voices, hers was quiet, but unshakable. Fatima al-Fikhri didn't build the world's first university to be remembered, but in doing so, she ensured that generations after her would have a place to remember themselves, as students, as seekers, as minds worthy of expansion. And that is a legacy no time can erase. When people think of a medieval mosque, they often imagine silence, a place for prayer, for stillness, for whispered devotion. They picture men in robes, bowing in neat rows, reciting verses under candlelight. But inside the walls of Al-Qarawiyyin, the air held more than just prayers. It also held ideas, because Fatima al-Fikhri's university was never meant to teach just one thing. It began, yes, with religion, with the Quran, with recitation, with faith at its core. But faith, in her world, was not about closing the mind, it was about opening it. And so, what started with scripture slowly unfolded into something far broader, a place of multidisciplinary learning. Here, under the same arches where worshippers once stood in silence, students debated math problems. They studied algebra, long before the word became associated with modern textbooks. They measured stars. They sketched geometric shapes across parchment with ink-stained fingers. In Al-Qarawiyyin, math was not separate from faith. It was a language of the divine. Understanding symmetry, ratio, proportion, these were not just technical skills. They were ways to glimpse the order of creation. To calculate, to reason, to measure the heavens was, in its own quiet way, a kind of worship. And so they studied the stars. Astronomy was more than curiosity, it was necessity. The lunar calendar guided religious festivals. The Qibla, the direction of prayer, had to be determined with precision. To know where Mecca lay meant knowing the shape of the earth, the patterns of the sky. Students at Al-Qarawiyyin learned to chart the night. They memorized constellations. They tracked planetary motion. They knew the names of stars that today still echo in scientific vocabulary. Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Vega, all passed down through Arabic translations. But the sky wasn't the only thing being studied. The body was too. Medicine held a central place in the university's offerings. From Greek texts preserved and translated into Arabic to Islamic treatises that pushed knowledge further, Al-Qarawiyyin became a place where the mysteries of the human form were explored with care and curiosity. Students learned anatomy. They memorized symptoms. They debated treatments. They read the works of Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna. They compared theory with observation, philosophy with practice. Illness was not treated with fear, but with method, with study, and perhaps more importantly, it was treated with compassion. Because behind every discipline, whether celestial or surgical, was a guiding idea. That knowledge is a service. That to understand the world is to be better prepared to care for it, whether that meant healing the body or simply illuminating the mind. Many of these ideas would later find their way to Europe, carried through translation, trade, and time. The seeds planted in Fez would ripple outward, influencing thought from Spain to Italy and beyond. In quiet ways, Al-Qarawiyyin helped shape what we now call the Renaissance. But none of that would have happened if the university had only taught one thing. Its strength was its range. Here, religion stood beside reason, theology beside theory, logic beside poetry. The sacred and the scientific weren't enemies, they were collaborators. And perhaps that was the genius of Fatima al-Fihri's vision. She didn't just create a place to learn scripture, she created a space where the entire world could be studied, from the stars above to the bones beneath our skin. From the structure of language to the pulse of the human heart. It's easy now to divide knowledge into categories. Science here, religion there, art somewhere else. But in Al-Qarawiyyin's early days, there were no such walls. A student might spend the morning in prayer, the afternoon solving equations, and the evening tracing constellations in a dusty courtyard, and through it all, the university remained grounded. Not in prestige, not in competition, but in access. Because Fatima had built it for the people, for those who hungered not just for belief, but for understanding, for those who wanted to think deeply, ask difficult questions, learn without fear. She didn't set the curriculum. She didn't write the textbooks, but her presence remained in every discipline taught within those walls. And in doing so, she gave the world something rare, a place where the mind and the soul could both belong. She never stood at a lectern. She never wrote a treatise. She never addressed crowds, nor debated loudly in a public square. And yet, Fatima al-Fihri changed the very idea of where knowledge belongs and who is allowed to hold it. In a time when books were scarce and only the privileged few could read, when scholarship was a guarded treasure of the elite and the male, Fatima did not argue for change, she simply built it. No manifestos, no banners, just bricks and vision. What she constructed in the heart of Fez was more than a building. It was a quiet revolution, a redefinition of who could learn, who could teach, and what counted as worthy of study. Without raising her voice, she carved out a space where minds could unfold without fear. And perhaps what made it so revolutionary was how unassuming it looked. Al-Qarawiyyin didn't gleam with gold. It wasn't wrapped in royal marble. Its courtyards were simple. Its arches, elegant but restrained. Students sat on woven mats. Teachers spoke slowly in shaded halls. There was no fanfare, only focus. And within those quiet moments, change was happening. Because for centuries, knowledge had been a mirror, reflecting back the values of power. It was controlled, guarded, often hidden behind status or gender or wealth. But Fatima imagined something else. A university where knowledge wasn't about prestige, it was about purpose. She didn't try to be loud in a world of noise. She simply made space for others to speak. And that, too, is power. She understood something rarely spoken at the time. That building a place for others to learn is an act of faith. Not just religious faith, but faith in people, in their capacity to grow, in their ability to seek truth for themselves, and in the ripple effect of a well-taught mind. Fatima never claimed authority, but in allowing others to think freely, she exercised the rarest kind of leadership, the kind that empowers, then steps back. And perhaps that is why her story resonates even now. In today's world, we often expect impact to come with volume. We imagine that to change history, one must shout louder than the rest. That visibility equals value. That silence is submission. But Fatima al-Fihri was not silent out of fear. She was silent out of purpose. Her quiet was not weakness. It was structure. It was strategy. She poured her energy not into demanding space, but into creating space, not for herself, but for knowledge to live. In doing so, she rewrote the role of knowledge itself. It was no longer the property of the few, no longer restricted to men of title or wealth, no longer something to be memorized and passed down without question. At Al-Qarawiyyin, knowledge became a shared inheritance, earned through study, deepened by conversation, grounded in faith, but not limited by it. And she made it last. Not for a season, not for a decade, but for over a millennium. Today, students still walk through the gates of Al-Qarawiyyin. They sit in the same courtyards. They listen in the same echoing halls. The subjects may have changed, the tools may be different, but the purpose remains: to learn, to think, to grow. And though many of them may not speak her name aloud, they carry her legacy with every page they turn. Fatima's life reminds us of something deeply human, that we don't always need to be the one in the spotlight to make light. That supporting the minds of others is a kind of immortality. That education, when given freely and generously, can outlive even our names. She didn't challenge the patriarchy with protest. She didn't demand that society change. She simply built something so useful, so undeniable, so quietly brilliant, that the world had to change around it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most powerful kind of revolution of all. In the quiet city of Fez, where the sun warms narrow alleys and birdsong echoes between blue walls, a woman once laid the first stone of a future she would never fully see. Fatima Al-Fihri did not live to witness the full bloom of what she began. She would never know how far her university's name would travel, or how deeply its roots would run. She simply built with conviction, offering what she had, and trusting that knowledge, once given space, would find its way. And it did. Long after she was gone, Al-Qarawiyyin continued to grow. It weathered wars, dynasties, famines, and change. But what endured wasn't just the stone, it was the spirit. That spirit reached beyond the city, beyond the faith it was founded within, and far beyond any border that maps might try to draw. Because while Fatima's world was shaped by Islam, her vision held something more expansive, a belief that truth and wisdom don't belong to one culture, one religion, or one tongue. They belong to everyone who seeks them, with sincerity, with humility, and with care. And so Al-Qarawiyyin, while rooted in Islamic tradition, welcomed minds from many walks of life. Jews, Christians, and Muslims studied side by side. Scholars from across North Africa, Andalusia, Egypt, and even Europe came to sit under its arches. They came to learn, to read, to debate, to write. The subjects taught were never limited to theology alone. Philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, grammar, law, all were given equal footing. The human mind, in all its complexity, was the true curriculum. This openness was not an accident. It was a quiet reflection of Fatima's values. She could have created a space reserved only for the elite, only for men, only for believers of one kind. But she didn't. The walls she built were not meant to keep people out, but to keep knowledge in, long enough for it to be shared. And that knowledge did not stay in Fez. It traveled, translated by wandering scholars, copied into manuscripts, carried on the backs of camels across deserts, whispered in foreign tongues in faraway cities. The lessons first taught under Al-Qarawiyyin's roofs would ripple outward, influencing thought from Spain to Sicily, from North Africa to the heart of Europe. In this way, Fatima's legacy became borderless. A Muslim woman, founding a school in the 9th century, helped shape the intellectual soil of the Renaissance, though her name rarely appeared in its retelling. And yet, you can still feel her presence, in the quiet endurance of her creation, in the questions that still echo through classrooms, in the way knowledge flows, without passport or permission, from mind to mind. Her story reminds us of something often forgotten, that learning is a human right, not a cultural ornament. That a good idea, once spoken, does not ask who is listening. It simply travels, it connects, it lasts. Today, in an era of division, of walls and labels, her legacy feels more urgent than ever. Because Fatima did not ask what someone believed before offering them the chance to think. She trusted that curiosity could be its own kind of bridge, that shared learning might lead to shared respect, that minds sitting together, even across differences, could find something in common. And that hope, tucked inside an institution built of earth and faith, is what made Al-Qarawiyyin extraordinary. It was not just a place to learn, it was a place to belong. And that sense of belonging, the feeling that knowledge is for you, too, is perhaps the most radical idea of all, especially when offered by a woman in the 9th century, especially when it endures. Fatima al-Fihri is no longer here. Her voice has faded. Her story, though rising now, was silent for far too long, but her gift remains, a place where strangers became students, where faith met thought, where minds crossed oceans without ships, a place where borders softened and ideas took flight. There are names that history shouts, carved in stone and echoed in textbooks. And then there are names whispered, softly, quietly, almost lost to time. Fatima al-Fihri was one of the latter. For centuries, her name drifted in silence. While kings were remembered for conquests and philosophers for words, Fatima was rarely mentioned. Not because she did less, not because she mattered less, but because her story didn't fit the usual mold, the one history prefers to tell. She had no throne, no army, no titles, only a vision and a university. She didn't write great treatises or lead revolutions. She didn't stand in the streets declaring her intent. Instead, she quietly built something the world had never seen before and left it behind for others to use. And yet, when you turn the pages of most history books, especially in the West, you'll rarely find her. Al-Qarawiyyin might be listed as a footnote. It might appear in a timeline about universities or Islamic architecture, but the woman who made it possible, often invisible. For a long time, the world forgot to ask, who laid the first stone? But forgetting is not the same as erasing. Time, after all, is patient. While names faded from scrolls, the doors of Al-Qarawiyyin stayed open. Students still came, teachers still taught. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, like fire gently carried through the dark. And that fire, though quiet, never went out. Eventually, people began to look back, to ask better questions. Who built this place? Who funded it? Who imagined it when no one else could? And the answer, soft, almost unbelievable, was Fatima, a woman in the 9th century who built a university that never closed. It surprises people, still, not because it shouldn't be possible, but because we've been taught not to expect women at the center of such stories. Especially not in medieval history, especially not in the Islamic world, especially not in education. But Fatima was there, from the beginning, not loud, not demanding, just steady. She lived her values. She didn't ask for recognition. She gave what she could, built what she believed in, and let the work speak for itself. And speak it did, through the rustle of pages turned in its library, through the soft murmur of debates in shaded courtyards, through the footsteps of students walking paths she once walked. Her presence lingers, not in statues or portraits, but in purpose. Today, people across the world walk into universities without knowing her name. They sit in lecture halls, take notes, ask questions. They study science, philosophy, poetry, law. They do all the things that Al-Qarawiyyin made possible long before the concept of university existed in most of the world. They don't know it, but they are walking in her footsteps. Every student who has ever found shelter in knowledge, every woman who has ever dreamed of more than what her time allowed, every mind that has ever asked, why not me? They are continuing what Fatima began. And that is the quiet magic of her legacy. She didn't build a place to be remembered. She built a place so that others could remember themselves. That they were worthy of learning, that their minds mattered, that education could be a sacred act, a human right, a shared inheritance. Fatima was not forgotten because she failed. She was forgotten because history has long been written by those who choose which stories to tell. But time, slow, impartial, endlessly curious, has a way of returning to what matters. And now, her name is being spoken again, in classrooms, in documentaries, in books and podcasts and whispers of awe. Her story is being shared, not because she asked for it, but because it demands to be told. And in the telling, something shifts. We realize that the past is fuller than we thought, that women were always there, building, imagining, guiding, that quiet is not the absence of impact, that legacy does not require applause. Fatima al-Fihri built a university. But more than that, she built a mirror, one that reflects a truth many had forgotten. That brilliance is not bound by gender. That vision does not need permission. And that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones almost lost. She may not appear in every history book, but her influence lives in every open mind, and in that way, she is not gone. She is not lost. She is simply waiting to be remembered. Fatima al-Fihri's story doesn't end with a statue, a monument, or a grand speech. It ends the way it began, with quiet strength. In a world where most women were told to stay small, she built something vast. In a time when education was reserved for the privileged few, she opened the gates for many. She did not lead with force. She led with vision, with faith, with patience, and she never asked to be remembered. But now, as her name begins to return to our consciousness, centuries later, it reminds us that legacy isn't about noise. It's about intention. It's about the work we do when no one is watching. About building something not for recognition, but for others to stand inside long after we're gone. Fatima gave the world a gift, not just a university, but a reminder that the mind and the soul are not separate, that faith and knowledge can sit at the same table, that education is not a luxury, but a right, and that one woman, with no crown, no army, and no permission, can quietly reshape the course of human history. Her footsteps are faded. Her voice was never recorded. But her impact lives on. In books, in classrooms, in every place where someone dares to ask questions and seek truth. Fatima al-Fihri did not ask the world to remember her. But now that we do, we see her clearly, not just as a figure of the past, but as a light for the future. Proof that even in the quietest corners of time, someone, somewhere, was planting something that still blooms today. In the modern world, the idea of a man wearing makeup might still turn heads. It's often treated as something unusual, unconventional, or even controversial. But if you were to step back in time, 100 years, 1,000, or even further, you might find that the opposite was true. In many ancient cultures, men wore makeup proudly, not as an act of rebellion, not for entertainment, but simply because that's what people of status did. Throughout much of human history, makeup was not about gender. It was about meaning, about rank, protection, ritual, and identity. It was as common for a man to wear eyeliner as it was for a king to carry a sword. In fact, in some places, the absence of makeup on a man's face would have been more surprising than its presence. Let's begin in ancient Egypt. The black lines you've seen around the eyes of pharaohs in carvings and tomb paintings weren't just for decoration. They were made from a substance called coal, a mixture of crushed minerals, often containing galena and other lead-based materials. This dark powder was applied with precision around the eyes, not to look alluring, but to ward off infection, reduce glare from the sun, and protect against evil spirits. Egyptian men of high rank, from priests to rulers, wore more coal than women. It wasn't a cosmetic touch. It was a daily ritual, a form of armor. In imperial China, beauty standards took a different form. During the Tang dynasty, male scholars and noblemen would often tint their lips red, not to seem feminine, but to signal refinement, intellect, and power. A red mouth meant you belonged to the literati, to the class of those who read, wrote, and governed. It wasn't flirtation. It was prestige. Even fingernails held meaning. Men with long, carefully manicured nails, sometimes painted, sometimes adorned with guards made of gold or jade, used them to show they didn't do manual labor. Their hands were clean, untouched by physical work. In a society that prized symbolism, nails could speak louder than words. In Japan's Edo period, the fierce samurai were also familiar with makeup. White powder, red accents, blackened teeth. These weren't random touches. They were part of a larger performance, not just on stage, as in the theatre traditions of No and Kabuki, but also in ceremony, in war, in death. A painted face could become a spiritual mask, separating the warrior from his human self. When facing battle, it was not uncommon for a samurai to paint his face like a ghost or a god, so that he might face death without fear, already half removed from the mortal world. Across the globe, in the courts of 17th century Europe, noblemen wore thick white powder on their faces. They added rouge to their cheeks, darkened their brows, and even placed tiny artificial beauty marks on their skin, little dots of velvet, sometimes in the shape of moons or stars. These weren't just for show, they carried coded messages about one's political allegiance, romantic availability, or social wit. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, was said to wear so much powder that his face looked almost like a mask, and yet, in his court, he set the trend, and everyone followed. All of this tells us something quietly profound. Makeup, throughout history, was never just about looking good, it was about saying something. About who you were, where you belonged, and what you believed. Men wore makeup not to break the rules, but because it was the rule of class, of power, of spiritual alignment. Only in the more recent centuries, under the influence of industrialization, religious reform, and shifting social codes, did male grooming begin to shrink into utilitarian simplicity. And even then, the traces of the past remain. In colognes, in hair pomades, in the silent rituals of shaving and styling, the mirror still speaks, even if more quietly now. So when you hear someone say, "Makeup is for women," remember this. Once upon a time, it wasn't. It was for the king, the priest, the poet, the warrior. For the man who walked not just through the world, but through the meanings behind it. In the golden sands of ancient Egypt, long before fashion magazines or cosmetic counters, men and women alike reached for a small stick dipped in black powder. With gentle care, they lined their eyes in bold, dark strokes. But this act was not about vanity. It was about vision, both physical and spiritual. The powder they used was called kohl, a mixture of crushed minerals, often including galena, a naturally occurring lead sulfide. Applied around the eyes with a wooden or ivory stick, kohl formed the thick black outlines we now associate with pharaohs, gods, and tomb paintings. But to the Egyptians, these lines weren't just beautiful. They were essential. The first reason was surprisingly practical. Egypt, for all its majesty, was also a harsh and blinding place. The desert sun reflected off sand and water with a brightness that could be painful to the eyes. Kohl, much like the eye black worn by modern athletes, helped reduce glare. It shaded the eyes from the sun's punishing rays. In a way, it was the world's first pair of sunglasses, only more elegant. But the second reason was far more ancient and far more sacred. Egyptians believed that the eyes were not just for seeing, they were for channeling divine energy. The eyes connected the body to the gods. To protect them was to protect the soul. So, kohl wasn't just a cosmetic. It was a shield, a magic barrier. It was believed to ward off evil spirits, protect against disease, and even heal infections. Modern science has found some truth to this belief. Traces of lead in kohl, when used carefully, may have helped stimulate the immune system, acting as a mild antiseptic. In other words, it might have worked not through myth, but through chemistry. Still, for the Egyptians, it was never just about science. It was about symbolism. To line your eyes in black was to align yourself with the gods, especially Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky. The famous Eye of Horus symbol, a sacred image seen on amulets and sarcophagi, was not merely decorative. It represented protection, healing, and wholeness. When Egyptians painted their eyes, they were echoing this divine pattern, becoming reflections of Horus himself. This is why makeup in ancient Egypt was not gendered. It wasn't considered feminine. It wasn't frivolous. It was ritual. Men wore kohl. Warriors wore kohl. Priests, farmers, even children might wear it during ceremonies. And the more important the occasion, birth, marriage, death, the more essential the eyeliner became. Pharaohs, in particular, wore it with pride. Their tombs are filled with images of finely lined eyes, often exaggerated, sometimes stretching beyond the natural lid to create wings, curves, and mystical shapes. These weren't fashion statements. They were spiritual messages. They said, "I see beyond this world. I am touched by the divine." The black lines weren't always alone. Green pigments made from malachite, another mineral, were also used, especially on the lower lids. Green was the color of rebirth and growth, associated with the god Osiris. In the palette of ancient Egypt, colors weren't just chosen for beauty, they were chosen for meaning. So, when a nobleman dipped his coal stick into a small stone pot, it was not an act of decoration, it was an act of connection to nature, to healing, to divinity, and perhaps also to memory, because even now, thousands of years later, we still recognize those eyes, painted in black, staring from temple walls and golden masks, timeless, powerful, unblinking. We might call it makeup today. But to the Egyptians, it was much more. It was medicine. It was magic. It was identity. So the next time you imagine ancient Egypt, don't picture men with bare faces under the desert sun. Picture them painted, not for beauty, but for survival, not to impress, but to endure. In that world, to line your eyes was to live, not a trend, not a phase, but a way to stay whole. In the quiet halls of ancient Chinese courts, where silk rustled gently and ink dried slowly on scrolls, appearance was never just appearance. Every detail, from the curve of a sleeve to the shade of one's mouth, spoke volumes. And in this refined world, makeup was not reserved for women. It was a language of class, culture, and cultivation, especially for men. During the Tang Dynasty, a golden age of art and poetry, male beauty was celebrated. Not in the way modern eyes might expect, not in strength or ruggedness, but in delicacy, in polish, in balance. A well-groomed man was not thought of as vain. He was seen as civilized. It was common, even fashionable, for male scholars and nobles to tint their lips red. The practice wasn't hidden or shameful. In fact, it was admired. Red lips were a sign of sophistication. They showed that a man didn't labor in the sun or toil in the fields. His hands held brushes, not tools. His thoughts wandered through calligraphy, not commerce. The red pigment used on the lips was often made from natural minerals or plant dyes. It was subtle, not flashy, a soft flush, a graceful mark of care. To wear it was to say, "I understand beauty. I live in a world of thought." In literature from the period, male characters with rose-tinted lips were often portrayed as intelligent, poetic, and sensitive to art. It might seem surprising now, but at the time, it was simply part of the standard for elite men, just as keeping one's robe free from dust or one's hair neatly tied was a sign of inner order. The outside reflected the inside. Another quiet but meaningful detail was found at the tips of the fingers. Long fingernails, sometimes painted or dyed, were considered a mark of nobility and scholarly distinction. If your nails were long, it meant you didn't need to work with your hands. If they were colored, often with plant-based dyes like crushed petals or herbal tints, they became even more powerful as a symbol, not of glamour, but of grace. In some dynasties, noblemen even wore nail guards, delicate curved shields made of gold, silver, or jade. These weren't just decorative. They protected the long nails, but more importantly, they announced the man's status without a word. You didn't have to declare your rank. Your fingertips said it for you. In Chinese philosophy, appearance and inner character were deeply connected. A man who paid attention to his grooming was seen as someone who also paid attention to his conduct, his speech, his ethics. Cleanliness was next to wisdom. Harmony in dress mirrored harmony in thought. And in a world ruled by Confucian values, respectability and presentation were serious matters. A scholar might study Confucius by day and apply a touch of color to his lips by evening, not as a contradiction, but as a continuation. The well-balanced life included beauty, not for seduction, but for serenity. This tradition wasn't isolated. In art, we find images of male poets with calm expressions, flowing robes, and gentle features. They carry scrolls, not swords. Their faces are soft, serene, their nails long, their lips faintly red. Even in death, this aesthetic endured. In some tombs, male remains have been found with traces of mineral pigment near the mouth, or with small ceramic containers believed to hold makeup. These were not tokens of femininity, but of dignity. So, if we look back with modern eyes and wonder, why would a man wear makeup? The ancient Chinese answer might be, why wouldn't he? For the men of those times, beauty was not feminine. It was philosophical. It meant you cared for what you touched, how you spoke, and how you moved through the world. And that was the sign of a true gentleman. Not flashy, not proud, just quietly refined. In the misty stillness of Edo-era Japan, where pine trees whispered in temple courtyards and paper lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, the image of the samurai was carved into the nation's soul. Warriors bound by honor, duty, and an unwavering calm. They moved with precision, spoke with restraint, and some of them wore makeup, not out of vanity, not to impress, but to transform. In Japan, appearance was never just skin deep. It was ceremony, it was discipline, and for the samurai, makeup was part of the mask they wore between this world and the next. Though often imagined as stoic swordsmen clad in armor, samurai culture had its roots deeply intertwined with performance, with symbolism, and with the unseen forces that moved through life and death. Their rituals, both in battle and in daily life, were shaped by centuries of belief in spirits, in purity, in transformation. In the Edo period, makeup among men wasn't limited to actors on stage. It had spiritual weight. Samurai, especially those engaged in formal ceremonies or preparing for battle, sometimes applied white face powder, red pigments, or blackened teeth. These gestures were not for beauty. They were for metamorphosis. The use of white face powder, known as oshiroi, was borrowed from traditions in court life and the theatre. But when worn by warriors, it took on a more profound meaning. The pale face resembled that of a ghost or a deity, blurring the boundary between man and myth. It stripped away the self, replacing it with an ideal, a force. A samurai with a painted face was no longer just a man. He was a vessel for something greater: honor, vengeance, memory. Red was another color of power. Applied to the lips, around the eyes, or across the cheeks, red symbolized life force, passion, and divine strength. In No and Kabuki theater, heroic characters often wore stylized red patterns across white faces. The samurai borrowed this iconography not to mimic performers, but to echo their symbolism. These painted lines turned a face into a mask, a way to confront fear, to silence emotion, to prepare for sacrifice. Perhaps the most haunting gesture was the act of blackening the teeth, a custom known as ohaguro. Made by mixing iron filings with vinegar or tea, the solution stained the teeth a deep black. It was practiced by both men and women in different periods, often to show marital status or maturity. But for some warriors, especially those preparing for ritual suicide or a final battle, blackening the teeth was part of severing ties with the human world. It said, "I am ready to die with dignity." The body was dressed, the hair styled, the face prepared, not to be remembered as oneself, but as a symbol. These practices didn't arise in isolation. They were shaped by the surrounding worlds of theatre, religion, and social order. The line between the stage and the battlefield was thinner than it seemed. In Kabuki, actors exaggerated every gesture. In the life of a samurai, every gesture was controlled. But both understood the power of presence, of how a painted face could silence doubt, command respect, or invoke awe. Even the structure of a samurai's life mirrored performance. They memorized roles, followed strict scripts, and faced death as if bowing to the final curtain. In such a world, makeup was not just allowed, it was fitting. To the modern eye, a painted warrior might seem like a contradiction. Strength and softness, fierceness and fragility. But to the samurai, those opposites weren't enemies. They were balance. A face dusted in powder, lined with red, shadowed with meaning. It didn't hide weakness. It declared purpose. In Edo, Japan, to wear makeup as a man was not to shed masculinity. It was to elevate it, to turn it into myth, into ritual, into something eternal. So the next time you picture a samurai, don't imagine only armor and steel. Imagine him seated calmly, dipping a brush into soft white powder, gazing into a lacquered mirror, a warrior becoming more than flesh, preparing not just for battle, but for legend. In the candlelit corridors of 17th century Europe, power whispered in silk and rustled beneath layers of lace. It drifted not through swords or muskets, but through perfume, posture, and powdered skin. And at the heart of this carefully crafted world stood the nobleman, powdered, perfumed, and painted, a vision of elegance and authority. At first glance, a gentleman of the court might seem like a statue, his face pale as porcelain, his hair not his own, but a grand curled wig that cascaded past his shoulders. On his cheek, perhaps, a single dark beauty spot, round, deliberate, and entirely artificial. These elements were not quirks of fashion, they were tools of presentation. Each one told a story of wealth, of health, of identity. The foundation of this aesthetic was white face powder. It was made from ground chalk, crushed starch, and in some unfortunate cases, lead. Applied in thick layers, it created a flawless, marble-like complexion. But the goal was not just smoothness, it was symbolic whiteness, a visual cue of nobility. In the 17th century, a pale face did not suggest weakness, it suggested privilege. Only those who did not work outdoors, who lived lives of leisure and intellect, could afford to keep their skin untouched by the sun. A tan meant labor, a glowless face meant class. And so men, just as much as women, dusted their cheeks, their foreheads, and their necks with powder. Sometimes they even powdered their ears. This wasn't done in secret. It was expected. A bare face would have been a social faux pas in the gilded salons of Versailles or London. To complement the face, the wig became the crown. These towering pieces, often made from horsehair or human hair, came in a variety of shapes and shades. Some were white, others grey or pale blonde, depending on fashion. They were styled in ringlets, tied with ribbons, or perfumed with lavender. Wigs weren't merely accessories, they were status signals. The bigger the wig, the bigger the statement. Why wigs? The practical reason was simple. Head lice were rampant, and shaving the head made it easier to manage. But the cultural reason went deeper. A wig was theatrical. It transformed the man. It elevated him, quite literally. It was authority woven into hair. And then, there were the beauty patches, small pieces of black velvet or silk, cut into perfect circles, crescents, or hearts. These were carefully placed on the face, near the lips, beside the eye, above the brow. While they appeared playful, they were layered with meaning. Each patch had a name. A spot near the mouth might be called the flirt, near the eye, the passionate, on the cheek, the gallant. In some cases, beauty spots even hinted at political affiliations or romantic intentions. They were codes, readable only to those in the know. A man might enter a ballroom with his face powdered like moonlight, his wig powdered to match, and a tiny black star on his cheek. He wasn't hiding himself, he was performing himself, playing the role of the ideal courtier, the polished gentleman, the learned aesthete. None of this was considered effeminate, quite the opposite. In the courts of Louis XIV, or Charles II, refinement was a measure of masculinity. The ability to carry oneself with grace, to speak in poetry, to dress in velvet and lace. These were signs of power. A man who did not participate in these rituals might be seen as crude, or worse, uncultured. This world did not last forever. With the rise of Enlightenment rationalism, industrial practicality, and changing social structures, powdered faces and towering wigs slowly faded. But for a time, in that strange and glittering century, male beauty was ornate, public, and proud. So the next time someone tells you that men didn't wear makeup in the past, you might remember the gentleman of 17th century Europe, powdered from brow to chin, crowned with curls, and marked with stars. Not out of vanity, but out of ritual, of status, and of a belief that beauty was power. In the modern world, nail polish and facial makeup are often seen as tools of self-expression, ways to enhance beauty, explore creativity, or simply enjoy color. But in many ancient civilizations, these painted surfaces held deeper meaning, not emotional, not aesthetic, but social. In those times, the color on your face or hands wasn't just a choice, it was a marker of your place in the world. Let's begin in ancient China, where nail color was not a matter of style, but of status. During the Zhou dynasty, and later in the Tang and Ming periods, long nails were considered a sign of nobility. To take it further, elites often stained their nails with gold or crimson hues, made from natural dyes and herbs. The message was clear: I do not work with my hands. The longer and more vibrant the nails, the higher the class. For commoners, this kind of display was forbidden. In fact, there were laws, sumptuary laws, that restricted certain colors, garments, and even grooming habits to specific classes. Painting your nails gold if you weren't noble could result in punishment. Beauty, in this context, was not a right. It was a privilege. Similar systems appeared in India, where makeup was used to divide, not just adorn. In ancient Sanskrit texts, different types of face and body paint were recommended depending on one's varna, the caste system that organized society. Certain oils and pastes, scented or colored, were reserved for the priestly and warrior classes. Others were deemed too sacred, too rare, or too expensive for anyone outside the upper castes to touch. To wear the wrong makeup, or to wear any at all, if you were in a lower caste, could be seen as an act of arrogance, a challenge to the invisible but deeply rooted social hierarchy. In Persian and Babylonian courts, eye makeup wasn't simply decorative. Dark kohl lined the eyes of kings and high priests, forming both a shield and a statement. The materials used, often costly minerals ground into fine powders, were unavailable to commoners. To line your eyes with them was to declare wealth, access, and religious favor. Even in Mesoamerican cultures, like the Maya, paint had power. Red pigments, made from cinnabar, a toxic but sacred mineral, were used in rituals, but also as part of elite burial and ceremonial dress. To paint one's face in red was not just to stand out, it was to signify a spiritual rank, a cosmic identity. For warriors, face paint became a badge of initiation. Certain patterns were worn only by those who had proven themselves in battle. Certain colors belonged only to priests or rulers. These visual codes were passed down through generations, sometimes hidden in patterns or tied to myths. A simple stripe, a dot above the brow, a red handprint on the cheek. These weren't decorations. They were identifiers. In medieval Europe, as social classes solidified, the idea of grooming also became tiered. The upper classes powdered their faces, curled their wigs, and perfumed their gloves. The poor, by contrast, were often forbidden from using scented oils or colored powders. In many cities, laws regulated the amount of gold thread, the brightness of dyes, or the size of headdresses that could be worn by merchants versus nobility. The purpose was always the same: to make status visible. This is why, historically, beauty practices were not just personal, they were political. A painted face could be an invitation or an offense. A dyed nail could be a badge or a crime. Who you appeared to be had to match who you were, at least in the eyes of the state. So when we look back and see paintings, scrolls, or statues of ancient people with bright faces and shining nails, we should remember they weren't just getting ready for the day. They were occupying their place in society, visibly, unmistakably. In those worlds, color was language, and your body was your biography. In the modern day, we often think of beauty as something outward, a way to be seen, admired, or remembered by others. But in many ancient cultures, beauty wasn't just about appearance. It was about recognition, not by other people, but by something far greater, the divine. To be beautiful, in the eyes of ancient people, was to be prepared. Prepared for ritual, prepared for death, prepared to meet the gods. Across civilizations, makeup and adornment were not limited to festivals or ceremonies of the living. They were often most intensely used in moments of passage, during rites of initiation, during mourning, and especially in burial. In Mesoamerican belief, for example, the soul's journey after death was complex and perilous. The Maya, in particular, believed that the afterlife was layered, full of trials and thresholds. To reach the other side, a soul needed more than prayers. It needed tools, symbols, and a body prepared in the right way. This is why important individuals were buried, not only with offerings, but also with painted bodies. Red pigment, often made from cinnabar, was spread over the bones or skin. It wasn't merely decorative, it was sacred. Red symbolized life, blood, and transformation. To be red was to be in between, no longer among the living, but not yet forgotten. The same was true in ancient Egypt, where the act of adorning the dead was as important as feeding the living. Eye makeup, particularly kohl, was applied even to mummies. Faces were painted, lips were tinted. These touches weren't for show. They were intended to preserve identity, so that the gods could recognize the soul in the afterlife. In Egyptian belief, the face was a mirror of the soul. If it was not preserved or presented properly, the soul could become lost. To be recognized was to continue existing. And so the face, powdered, painted, framed, became a kind of passport to eternity. In Hindu tradition, the idea of adornment as spiritual readiness still echoes today. Marks on the forehead, tilaka or bindi, are not simply decoration. They signify connection, wisdom, and attention to the divine. During funerals or sacred rites, these marks are applied not only to the living but also to the dead, ensuring that the spirit knows its way and is known by higher powers. In Japanese culture, especially during the Edo period, theatrical rituals echoed this belief. A samurai preparing for death might blacken his teeth, apply powder to his face, and dress with care, not to please an audience, but to appear honorable before the ancestors. It was believed that how one entered death mattered deeply, and that the soul, carrying that final image, would be judged by the gods and spirits waiting beyond. In many parts of the world, face painting before battle was not about intimidation alone. Warriors from Celtic tribes to Polynesian islands decorated their skin to align with gods, to ask for favor, and to signal their readiness to transcend. The face became a canvas for prayer, a way to say, "I am here. I am prepared. I am more than flesh." In these ancient ways of thinking, beauty was not vanity. It was not selfish. It was a form of reverence. To paint the body was to speak to forces beyond words. To arrange the face was to say, "I know who I am, and I hope you do too." Even today, traces of these beliefs linger. We dress our dead with care. We apply makeup for important moments, weddings, rites of passage, farewells. We still carry the instinct that beauty is not just for others. It is a signal, a shape, a way of being seen by the world, by memory, and perhaps by the gods. In ancient times, a painted face wasn't a performance. It was a beacon, glowing softly between earth and sky. Today, many people still hold the quiet belief that men should be simple, unconcerned with fashion, uninterested in grooming, quietly rugged, natural. But if we step back through the centuries, we'll find something surprising. This idea that men shouldn't care about how they look is actually very new. For most of human history, male appearance was not something neglected. It was cultivated, cared for, displayed. In fact, to not care for one's appearance was once seen not as manly, but as unfit. A man of rank, of culture, of strength, he was expected to look the part. Take, for instance, the noblemen of ancient China. Their robes were tailored with symbolism. Their hair was oiled and coiled with purpose. Their faces might be powdered, their lips tinted. This wasn't hidden or controversial. It was the outward reflection of inner harmony. Appearance was part of ethics, or look to ancient Rome. The Roman elite bathed daily in communal baths, perfumed their bodies, and shaved or plucked facial hair meticulously. Oils were used to soften the skin. Hairstyles followed the emperor's trends. To present oneself as refined was not a luxury, it was a duty. In Renaissance Europe, this pattern continued. Noblemen wore brocade coats, lace collars, gemstone rings. They dyed their beards, curled their wigs, and posed for portraits with a deliberate air. Their appearance wasn't just fashion, it was a statement of knowledge, of power, of alignment with cosmic order. Even in tribal societies across Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, male adornment played a central role. Warriors painted their bodies. Chiefs wore headdresses. Young men entering adulthood might spend hours, even days, being dressed, painted, and ornamented. These rituals were not for women's eyes. They were for the ancestors, the spirits, the community, and for the self. So how, then, did we arrive at today's quiet discouragement of male beauty? The shift began slowly, in stages. One key influence was religion. In some periods of Christian and Confucian thought, modesty was emphasized. Appearance began to be associated with pride, and pride with sin. The body was something to be disciplined, not displayed. Cleanliness remained important, but ornamentation was frowned upon, especially for men. Later, the Industrial Revolution changed everything. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as factories replaced farms and cities replaced courts, a new kind of masculinity was born. Practical, stoic, silent. The man of this new world wore plain suits. He worked long hours. He had no time for frills. His power came from productivity, not polish. The Victorian gentleman trimmed his nails but did not paint them. He combed his hair but did not scent it. The powdered wigs and beauty patches of earlier centuries were abandoned. In their place came neutrality, brown shoes, black coats, white collars, functional, minimal, serious. This transformation was reinforced by war. In the 20th century, the soldier became the model of manhood. Strength, endurance, sacrifice, not softness or style. Military uniforms taught generations of men to wear the same thing, every day, and when they returned from war, many kept that habit. Simplicity became associated with dignity. By the mid-1900s, the idea that a man might wear makeup, perfume, or jewelry had become almost unthinkable in many cultures. Fashion belonged to women. Appearance became their domain. Men were told to stand back, quietly, plainly, but deep down, something older remains. Today, we see signs of change. More men are experimenting again, with skincare, with color, with silhouette. They're not doing something new, they're remembering something old, because history tells a different story. It tells us that male beauty was once ritual, power, devotion, and art. That painted faces, scented skin, and layered robes weren't indulgences, they were roles played with pride. So perhaps the real question is not, why are some men caring about their appearance today? But rather, why did we ever ask them not to? In truth, the polished man is ancient. The plain man is modern. And somewhere in between, we find the space to choose again. Across the centuries and continents, through temples and tombs, courts and battlefields, one pattern remains, quiet but persistent, changing form, but never truly fading. The desire to be adorned, to touch the body with color, scent, or symbol, to become more than bare. We often think of beauty as decoration, as something light, optional. But the truth is, the act of beautifying oneself, painting the face, scenting the skin, arranging the hair, is not a modern invention, nor is it simply a matter of style. It is, and always has been, a human instinct. From the earliest burials found in prehistoric caves, archaeologists have uncovered traces of red ochre, a natural pigment gently applied to the bodies of the dead. Long before written language, before architecture or agriculture, someone took the time to mark the face, to color the bones, to signal care, not for function, but for meaning. The ancient Egyptians painted the eyes of their mummies, not just to preserve beauty, but to prepare the soul. The Maya covered their rulers in cinnabar. The Romans scented their public baths. The Chinese shaped long nails to show refinement. The French powdered their faces. The Japanese tied beauty to death. And in each place, in each time, the impulse was the same. To beautify was to mark a threshold between the ordinary and the sacred, between the human and the remembered. Even warriors, those we associate with grit and steel, took part in this tradition. Celts painted their faces blue before battle. Samurai dusted their cheeks with powder. Native warriors wore feathers and pigment, not just to intimidate, but to connect, to ancestors, to gods, to stories bigger than themselves. Beauty, in these cases, was not about vanity. It was about visibility, to be seen not just by others, but by the universe, by the divine, by time itself. And it wasn't limited to one gender. Men and women alike, used the body as a canvas, not because they wanted attention, but because they carried tradition. A mother might pass on the recipe for herbal perfumes. A father might teach his son how to tie a ceremonial headdress. These were not beauty routines, they were acts of heritage. Over time, ideas shifted. Trends came and went. Religions warned against excess. Economies shaped access. Empires rose and fell, taking their colors and customs with them. But even in silence, even under restriction, the human urge to shape the self remained. And now, in the present day, we find ourselves looping back. Makeup is no longer reserved for one group. Fragrance is no longer gendered. Jewelry appears on necks, wrists, and ears regardless of age or status. And while some may still debate the place of beauty in a modern world, one truth feels increasingly clear. To care about appearance is to care about expression. It's not always about attraction. Sometimes it's about protection. Sometimes performance. Sometimes remembrance. Sometimes it's just about feeling like yourself, or the version of yourself that you most recognize, because we are not blank slates. We are beings of symbol, of ritual, of longing, and the skin, our most visible layer, becomes the site of that storytelling. So when you paint your lips, or brush your hair a certain way, or choose a fabric that makes you feel steady, you're not doing something shallow, you're continuing something ancient. You're whispering to the past, and maybe, just maybe, the past is whispering back. In every culture, in every time, people have turned to the mirror, not to escape themselves, but to return to themselves. To say, this is who I am, or this is who I hope to be. And that is not weakness, that is not vanity, that is very human. In quiet ways, across forgotten centuries, the human body has always been more than skin and bone. It has been a canvas, a signal, a mirror for something deeper: status, spirit, memory, meaning. What we call makeup today is only a modern word for a timeless act. Long before cosmetics became products on a shelf, they were symbols of power, faith, mourning, and ritual. They guided the dead, they strengthened the living. They reminded the wearer and the watcher of who they were and what they carried. For men, especially, the story is often overlooked. Today, we imagine that beauty belongs to women. That care for appearance is something feminine, something optional, even unnecessary. But history gently corrects us. Pharaohs lined their eyes before battle. Scholars in China painted their lips red. Samurai powdered their faces before death. Kings wore wigs and rouge as marks of command. Warriors painted their faces to meet gods. From temples to thrones, battlefields to altars, men have long shaped their image with purpose, not to look good, but to belong, to a moment, a tradition, a legacy. And then, over time, this visibility faded. Simplicity became strength. Restraint became ideal. And for a while, the mirror turned quiet. But beauty never disappeared. It waited. And now, as boundaries shift and traditions blend, we begin to remember again that to adorn the self is not to betray it. It is to express it. Whether through color or texture, scent or silhouette, humans across time have returned to one truth. That appearance is not everything, but it is something. A kind of soft language, a ritual, a rite. So, if you ever pause before a mirror, unsure, wondering if it's too much or too bold, or not expected of you, remember, somewhere in the past, someone did the same. Not to be seen by others, but to be known by themselves and maybe by the gods. Beauty is not a trend. It is not new. It is ancient, and it is deeply, quietly human.